How one logistics mistake crippled the Wehrmacht in 1941. The problem no one in Germany wanted to talk about. In the summer of 1941, as German tanks rolled across the Soviet border, the world believed that nothing on earth could stop the Wehrmacht. They had conquered Poland in weeks, Norway with a handful of ships, France in 6 weeks, the Balkans in 2 months, and half of Europe in under 2 years. This army moved with a speed the world had never seen. The Blitzkrieg appeared unstoppable. But behind the victories, behind the fast-moving panzers and the dramatic maps, lay a problem so severe that it would cripple the German war effort before the first snow fell. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't the Red Army's counterattacks. It wasn't even Hitler's interference. It was something far more mundane. A logistics mistake made before the war even started. A mistake so fundamental that no matter how brilliantly the Wehrmacht fought, no matter how many encirclements they achieved, no matter how many Soviet divisions collapsed, victory in the East was impossible. This is the story of that mistake. The mistake that crippled the Wehrmacht long before Moscow, long before Stalingrad, long before Kursk. The German assumption that broke everything. To understand the mistake, we must understand the mindset of German planners in 1940-41. The OKH, Army High Command, believed the Soviet Union will collapse in 610 weeks. This assumption shaped everything. The number of divisions allocated, the amount of fuel prepared, the number of spare parts produced, the food rations, the winter gear, the number of trucks, the railway plans, the stockpiled ammunition, even the number of horses to be used. Germany prepared for a short, rapid, decisive war. What they got instead was a continental war of attrition against the largest land empire in the world. And their planning collapsed the moment the campaign became long. But the core of the catastrophe was one critical logistical decision. Germany never prepared a functioning supply system for a campaign beyond 500 kilometers. By August 1941, the Wehrmacht had outrun every supply lifeline it possessed. And it happened because of a miscalculation, mathematical, mechanical, and strategic, that went back decades. The secret weakness of the Wehrmacht. It was not a motorized army. German propaganda showed columns of panzers, convoys of trucks, motorized infantry advancing at lightning speed, mechanized assault forces, armored spearheads. This created the myth that Germany was a mechanized superpower. The truth was far more primitive. Only 10% of the German army was motorized. The other 90% moved by foot or by horse. Germany used over 600,000 horses in France, 1940, 750,000 horses in Barbarossa, 1941, 1 million horses by 1942. These horses pulled artillery, ammunition, food, fuel wagons, machine guns, anti-tank guns, field kitchens. The Wehrmacht was not a modern mechanized army. It was a 20th century army, built on 19th century logistics and 18th century transport methods. In France, this worked, because the campaign was short and the infrastructure was excellent. But in the Soviet Union, it became a disaster. The critical logistics problem, the wrong railway width. Joseph Stalin did not know it, but one of the greatest gifts he gave to the Soviet Union was a railway system incompatible with German trains. The Soviet rail gauge was 1520 millimeters. The German and European gauge was 1435 millimeters. A small difference, but an enormous logistical nightmare. When German forces entered Soviet territory, their trains could not run on Soviet rails. Their locomotives could not fit. Their supply cars were useless. Their spare parts did not match. Their engines could not use Soviet coal. Their engineers had no experience with the Soviet system. The only way to make the lines usable was to convert them. Railway crews had to tear out rails, move one rail inward, rebuild ties, replace switches, rebuild bridge crossings, reconfigure stations, install German telegraph lines. This took massive manpower and, critically, time. But here was the real problem. The German rail conversion crews were far too few to keep up with the army. Germany miscalculated the number of engineers, railway units, tools, locomotives, rail cars, track crews, construction battalions. They assumed the Soviet Union would collapse before rail conversion became a bottleneck. They were catastrophically wrong. By August 1941, German divisions were advancing 80 kilometers per day. The rail lines were advancing 8 to 12 kilometers per day. The gap widened every week. By late summer, it became impossible to supply the front. But Panzers ran on gasoline. Germany did not have enough German tanks. Panzer III, Panzer IV, and later Panthers ran on gasoline, not diesel. Gasoline was dangerous to transport, prone to explosion, required special containers, more scarce in Germany's synthetic fuel economy. Worse, German fuel barrels leaked in the rough roads of the Soviet Union. Trucks hauling gasoline frequently lost 10 to 20% of their cargo through vibration alone. Some lost over 30%. This meant trucks had to make more trips. Fuel deliveries were inconsistent. Panzer divisions constantly ran on empty. Commanders had to halt offensives to refuel. By September 1941, even successful German divisions had tanks sitting idle simply because there was no fuel to move them. But fuel wasn't the only problem. The greatest misunderstanding. German trucks could not survive Russian roads. On the maps in Berlin, the Soviet Union appeared to have endless roads. On the ground, those roads were gravel tracks, dirt paths, mud fields, seasonal trails, forest routes, unpaved, unmaintained, and unsuitable for heavy vehicles. German trucks designed for Western Europe's paved highways broke down in staggering numbers. By October 1941, over 40% of German trucks were permanently lost. Some divisions had only 30% of their original transport left. Maintenance crews ran out of spare parts. Thousands of trucks simply died on the roadside. But the real catastrophe was this. The trucks Germany lost in 1941 could never be replaced. Germany did not have the industrial capacity to rebuild its motor pool. The U.S. produced 2.4 million trucks in W22. Germany produced just 350,000. Once their truck fleet disintegrated, their logistics system collapsed. But this wasn't the end of the problem. There was something even worse. The final piece of the mistake. Germany had no plan for distance. The distances in the Soviet Union were unlike anything the Wehrmacht had ever faced. Distances from Warsaw to Smolensk, 670 kilometers, Smolensk to Moscow, 400 kilometers, Berlin to Moscow, 1 to 800 kilometers, Leningrad to Kiev, 1,000 kilometers, Kiev to Rostov, 100 kilometers for a German truck, 1 kilometer forward, Harsh to 1 kilometer backward to pick up supplies, Karsh 2 kilometers of wear, fuel use, and mechanical stress. The German logistics system simply could not physically support an army advancing more than 700 kilometers, but Hitler demanded they advance 500 kilometers. And yet, the Wehrmacht kept advancing anyway. This is the most shocking part of the story. German commanders in the field saw the crisis forming. They filed reports, fuel shortages growing, roads impassable, trucks failing faster than they can be repaired, rail conversion behind schedule, transport horses dying from exhaustion, supply columns too slow to support tank formations. But the orders from Berlin did not change. The reason? Hitler believed the Soviet Union was collapsing. The OKH believed logistics wasn't the issue. Political collapse would solve everything. The German General Staff assumed they wouldn't need to supply the army after October. They expected panic, mild surrender, mass defections, administrative collapse, a political implosion in Moscow. Instead, they hit an empire capable of absorbing losses at a level no European army had ever faced. But the logistics system was already broken. By September 1941, while the Wehrmacht was still winning battles, it was already losing the war. How one logistics mistake crippled the Wehrmacht in 1941. The moment the Wehrmacht outran its own war. By late July 1941, barely 5 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht had achieved victories on a scale unmatched in modern warfare. Army Group Center had encircled over 300,000 Soviet troops at Minsk, then another 200,000 at Smolensk. Army Group South captured Uman and pushed toward Kiev. Army Group North was closing in on Leningrad. It appeared that the Blitzkrieg had succeeded again. But behind the victories, German staff officers were beginning to panic, because by July, the Wehrmacht had already reached the maximum distance its logistics system could support. The army had outrun every fuel dump. The trucks were collapsing, the rail conversion lagged by hundreds of kilometers, and supplies reached the front weeks late. In Berlin, no one wanted to acknowledge this. In the field, everyone saw it. This is when the consequences of the 1930s miscalculations finally exploded. That the railway disaster expands. The supply lifeline breaks. To understand why the German advance slowed in August, you must look at the map not of battles, but of railway lines. On July 3, 1941, Hitler demanded that the army advance without halt toward Smolensk, Kiev, and Leningrad. But German supply officers responded that it was impossible. Why? Because the main railheads, the supply unloading points, were still. In Poland, hundreds of kilometers behind the front, operating at limited capacity, clogged with trains, lacking converted Soviet locomotives. Every kilometer the army advanced was one more kilometer. The rail supply lines had to stretch. By early August, trains could only reach Minsk and Vilnius. Fuel was often delivered by horse wagons. Frontline artillery had less than 40% of needed shells. Panzer divisions had only 30–40% functional tanks. Infantry divisions lacked boots, tents, food, ammunition. Spare parts had run out entirely. The Wehrmacht was advancing into a void, with a supply system that was dead on arrival. But Berlin didn't understand the scale of the problem, so they made it worse. The German motorization myth collapses. Nazis loved technology and propaganda. Both created a false image of a fully motorized army. The truth was devastatingly different. Only 30 German divisions were fully motorized. 150-plus divisions walked everywhere on foot. Over 600,000 horses carried supplies. And the horses, unlike German trucks, were not immune to the Eastern Front. They died from disease, exhaustion, Russian dust, lack of forage, Soviet partisans attacking horse columns, heat in summer, mud in fall, cold in winter. By September 1941, some infantry divisions had lost 40% of their horses. And when the horses died, the artillery simply stopped moving. In the Wehrmacht's own words, artillery without horses is scrap metal. This was the domino effect Germany never expected. The entire structure of Blitzkrieg began to collapse because its foundation horse logistics was crumbling. Another truck catastrophe. Germany bleeds vehicles faster than it can replace them. German trucks were excellent on paved European roads. On the vast, primitive Soviet road network, they were death traps. A typical German truck lifespan on the Eastern Front, France, 1940, 8 to 12 months. Soviet Union, 1941, 4 to 6 weeks. The reason was simple. Soviet roads were not roads. They were mud paths, sand tracks, deep ruts, and clay pits. German transport battalions reported broken axles, overheated engines, clogged air filters, destroyed tires, collapsed suspensions, shattered transmissions, burst fuel lines, ruined brakes. By September, the average German infantry division had lost half its trucks. Some had lost 70%. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had 200,000 American Lend-Lease trucks coming. Germany had no such allies. The U.S. could replace broken trucks. Germany could not. Every German supply convoy was a one-way trip to mechanical destruction. And the Wehrmacht's fuel crisis was about to detonate. Kunst the fuel nightmare. The Wehrmacht ran dry. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. Therefore, Germany never stockpiled fuel for a long war. The Wehrmacht started Barbarossa with only 2.7 months of fuel reserves, insufficient tanker trucks, limited gasoline refining capacity, synthetic fuel plants already overstretched. By August 1941, Panzer Group Guderian reported, "Fuel is our greatest enemy." Entire armored spearheads were stopping for days, simply because refueling was impossible. Divisions reported, tanks abandoned because they had no fuel, reconnaissance vehicles unable to scout, half-tracks left behind, artillery unable to move, trucks sitting empty, aircraft grounded due to lack of aviation fuel. German commanders were furious. Guderian himself shouted, "I cannot command empty fuel drums." But here was the fatal trap. Germany's entire fuel system depended on railroads, and the railroads were not functioning. Thus, the panzers designed to win the war quickly were now immobilized by the very terrain they conquered. The Soviet Union was too big for German mathematics. The logistics equations Germany used were based on European distances. For Poland, fine. For France, more than enough. But the Soviet Union was enormous, and German staff calculations didn't scale. Here is what officers discovered the hard way. It was physically impossible to supply German armies more than 500 to 700 kilometers past the railhead. Why? Because trucks burned too much fuel delivering fuel. Roads destroyed vehicles faster than they could be replaced. Horses died before returning. Ammunition weight exceeded transport capacity. Food spoiled before reaching frontline troops. Supply convoys were too slow. Every kilometer added exponential stress. A panzer division required 300 tons of supplies per day, at least 1,000 trucks to deliver it. Continuous flow of gasoline. Constant spare parts. Mechanics. Replacement vehicles. German divisions were now double the sustainable distance from their supply bases. They were advancing into a logistical black hole. And yet, Hitler ordered them to advance further. The crucial decision: halt or push forward. By mid-August 1941, the German offensive stalled, not because of Soviet resistance, but because the Wehrmacht could not move. Generals begged Hitler, "We need to halt the offensive." "We must wait for the railways to catch up. We require a month to restore transport. Trucks are collapsing faster than we can repair them." Hitler was unmoved. He believed stopping meant giving the Soviets time to reorganize. He ordered a renewed offensive. The panzers pushed deeper. The infantry struggled to keep up. The supply system shattered, and German divisions soon faced a level of logistical starvation unseen anywhere else in the war. But this wasn't the worst part. The worst part was a single logistical decision Hitler made at the end of August. A decision that ensured Germany would never reach Moscow in fighting condition. The decision that turned a struggling campaign into a doomed one. How one logistics mistake crippled the Wehrmacht in 1941. The decision that broke the German campaign. By late August 1941, the Wehrmacht was at its peak territorial success and at its lowest logistical capacity. German commanders faced a brutal reality. They could either stop and allow the railways to catch up, or keep advancing and risk total breakdown. Every supply officer recommended a halt. Every field commander saw the crisis forming. Panzer Group Guderian was short on fuel. Panzer Group Hoth lacked spare parts. Army Group Center's infantry was exhausted. Horses were dying at alarming rates. Trucks were collapsing by the thousands. Rail lines were weeks behind schedule. The solution was obvious. Pause the offensive. Let supplies flow. Prepare for Moscow. Instead, Hitler made the most consequential logistical mistake in German military history. He ordered the panzers of Army Group Center to split in two directions: south toward Kiev, north toward Leningrad, leaving no concentrated force for Moscow. This was not just a tactical error, it was a logistics catastrophe, because splitting the armored spearheads meant more distance, more fuel consumption, more trucks destroyed, more spare parts used, more strain on rail lines, more time lost, more logistical chaos. This was the moment historians agree on. Germany lost the logistical ability to reach Moscow before winter. But Hitler believed he was making a brilliant decision. The diversion to Kiev, a triumph that cost everything. Hitler was convinced that the Soviet armies around Kiev posed a threat to his southern flank, so he ordered Guderian's Panzer Group II to swing south, Hoth's Panzer Group III to help secure Smolensk, Army Group Center to halt the Moscow Drive. The goal? Encircle the massive Soviet forces in Ukraine. The result? The largest encirclement in military history. Over 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured. A stunning tactical victory. But it came at a price Germany could never repay. Because during the Kiev operation, panzer divisions burned colossal amounts of fuel. Trucks drove an extra 1,000 kilometers. The rail conversion fell even further behind. Spare parts were consumed at emergency rates. Engines failed beyond repair. Hundreds of tanks broke down from long marches. Infantry was forced to cover enormous distances on foot. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point. By the time Guderian's tanks turned back north to resume the drive on Moscow, it was already mid-September. The Wehrmacht had less fuel, fewer trucks, weaker tanks, exhausted divisions, longer supply lines, worse roads, no reserve of winter gear, and the Soviet Union, far from collapsing, was forming new armies behind the Volga. Kiev was a tactical masterpiece, but it destroyed Germany's strategic chances. As Heinz Guderian wrote later, "We won a victory in the wrong place and lost the war because of it." Oh, the clock runs out. The logistics do not. After the Kiev triumph, the Wehrmacht resumed the offensive toward Moscow. But the situation had changed completely. The Soviet Union now mobilized millions of fresh troops. The weather began to turn. Rail supplies were stuck in Poland. Trucks were dying faster than ever. Horses were collapsing from exhaustion. German divisions were undersupplied and underfed. Tanks lacked spare parts. And worst of all, the German high command still believed the Red Army was collapsing. This delusion prevented any realistic logistics planning. The final blow came in the form of weather. The Rasputitsa, the mud season that destroyed German mobility. In early October, the skies opened. Rain hammered the Soviet Union day after day, and suddenly the roads disappeared. Not figuratively, literally. German diaries describe it. Roads turned to rivers. We sank up to our axles. Horses drowned in mud. We pushed trucks by hand for kilometers. Fuel drums disappeared into the earth. Tanks bogged down and became targets. This was the Rasputitsa, the infamous mud season that strikes twice a year in Russia. The Wehrmacht was not prepared. How could they be? They had barely prepared for summer because they believed the war would be over by fall. Germany lost. Tens of thousands of horses, thousands of trucks, countless cannons, supply wagons, fuel barrels, entire convoys that vanished into 1 meter deep mud. A typical truck that used 30 liters per 100 kilometers in France now needed 300, 400 liters per 100 kilometers in Russia. Fuel consumption skyrocketed. Fuel reserves collapsed. Panzer commanders were forced to abandon functioning tanks because they had no gasoline. The German advance slowed to 5 kilometers per day, then 2, then 0. The Blitzkrieg was dead. But the Wehrmacht still tried to push toward Moscow. The The Wehrmacht arrives at Moscow with almost no supplies left. In late October, after weeks of mud and chaos, the ground froze. This solved one problem. The roads became hard enough to drive on, but it created worse problems. Temperatures fell below freezing. Supply trucks lacked winter oils. Horses froze. Men lacked winter clothing. Weapons jammed. Engines burst from cold. Medical supplies froze solid. Food rations turned to ice. The Luftwaffe's fuel gels turned to syrup. Vehicles broke from metal brittleness. And this is where the ultimate impact of the logistics mistake becomes clear. After 4 months of fighting, the Wehrmacht was no longer a mechanized army. It was an immobilized force struggling to survive. Panzer divisions had less than 50% of their tanks operational, 10–20% of their fuel, almost no spare parts, half dead horses, exhausted drivers, half their trucks lost, artillery unable to move, troops marching with worn-out boots. Infantry divisions reported frostbite casualties in the thousands, guns that could not fire, rations cut to starvation levels, no winter uniforms, no medical supplies, no anti-freezing lubricants. The Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered Europe, was now fighting the elements with almost no logistical support. And yet, Berlin demanded they attack Moscow anyway. The final advance, an army running on empty. In November 1941, the Wehrmacht launched its last attempt to break into Moscow. But the divisions that advanced were not the same divisions that had crossed the Soviet border in June. They were understrength, undersupplied, exhausted, freezing, low on ammunition, marching without food, moving without fuel, fighting without winter clothing, supported by a rail system that was still stuck hundreds of kilometers behind some German infantry units, advanced with only 3 to 5 rounds of ammunition per man. Panzer divisions attacked with only 30–40 operational tanks for entire corps. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel and de-icing. The horses Germany's true logistical engine were dying faster than they could be replaced. The German offensive reached the outskirts of Moscow. Some units reported seeing the city's outskirts. They could see the distant glow of Moscow at night, but they could not move any further. They had nothing left, no fuel, no ammunition, no spare parts, no winter clothing, no trucks, no horses, no reserves. They froze in place. And the Red Army struck back. How one logistics mistake crippled the Wehrmacht in 1941. When logistics decided the fate of the Eastern Front, by early December 1941, the Wehrmacht's advance had come to a halt at the gates of Moscow. Not because they were defeated in battle, not because they lacked courage, not because of Soviet superiority, but because the German army had destroyed its own ability to fight 4 months earlier. Through a single fatal miscalculation, Germany never prepared a supply system capable of supporting operations beyond 500–700 kilometers. Once they exceeded that distance, the laws of physics, engineering, and logistics took over, and no amount of bravery or tactical brilliance could compensate. The Wehrmacht was not defeated by Soviet tanks. It was defeated by broken trucks, dead horses, impassable roads, empty fuel drums, frozen weapons, collapsed supply lines, railways that never caught up, divisions starving on the march, hundreds of thousands of exhausted men. The German logistics system was not designed for a long war of movement over thousands of kilometers. But Hitler demanded it anyway, and now the bill arrived. The Red Army strikes back. The counteroffensive of December 1941. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet Union launched its winter counteroffensive with fresh Siberian divisions. German commanders were stunned. They believed the Soviets were on the brink of collapse. Instead, new divisions arrived fully equipped. Men wore winter uniforms. Tanks started reliably. Artillery had proper lubrication. Supply lines were short. Logistics were adapted for extreme cold. In contrast, The Wehrmacht faced temperatures of 25 degrees to 40 degrees, rifles that wouldn't fire, trucks frozen solid, tank engines cracking apart, horses dying in the snow, troops with no winter clothing, boots that stiffened like stone, rations frozen into bricks, artillery immobilized, men suffering frostbite by the tens of thousands. Historians estimate that frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties in many divisions. German soldiers wrote, "Our rifles are useless. We cannot move artillery. Fuel freezes in the barrels. We live like animals in the snow. We have no warm food. We cannot bury the dead." The Red Army pushed the Germans back 150 kilometers along the entire front. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht retreated. But this retreat was not a military defeat. It was a logistical collapse. The truth emerges. Logistics had decided the campaign. In summer after the winter crisis, German staff officers analyzed why the Moscow offensive failed. They concluded, the war was lost due to logistics, not combat. Internal reports stated, the distances were too great. Fuel reserves were inadequate. Truck losses were catastrophic. Rail conversion units were insufficient. Horses died faster than they could be replaced. Roads were unusable. Ammunition could not reach the front. Food supplies collapsed. Winter clothing never arrived. One general summarized, "We did not lose to the Russian soldier. We lost to Russian distance." Another wrote, "Barbarossa was decided in the first 8 weeks. We outran our supply system, and the army could never recover." This was the devastating realization. The Wehrmacht destroyed itself long before it reached Moscow, and the root of this collapse was a logistics error made years earlier. The original mistake. The German army never modernized its logistics. In the 1930s, Germany invested heavily in tanks, aircraft, artillery, infantry equipment, elite divisions, communications, tactical innovation. But they ignored the backbone of modern war: transport rail, capacity fuel reserves, motorization, spare parts, maintenance industry, winter equipment, road suitability, truck production. While preparing for Blitzkrieg, Germany never built the logistical engine required to sustain Blitzkrieg. This is why the Wehrmacht collapsed in 1941 despite brilliant tactical victories, and the consequences were irreversible. Know the long-term impact, why Germany never recovered? The logistical destruction of 1941 created problems Germany never solved. Truck shortages were permanent. Germany lost over 150,000 trucks in 1941 alone. It built only about 70,000 in 1942. Horses were irreplaceable. Millions died over the winter. Horse breeding takes years. Rail conversion never caught up. Supply bottlenecks lasted until 1944. Fuel reserves never recovered. By 1942, Germany was rationing fuel even for critical units. Spare parts were gone. Panzer divisions had lower readiness every year. Maintenance units were overwhelmed. Germany lacked trained mechanics. Engines wore out faster than expected. A tank engine built to last 1,000 kilometers was asked to last 3,000 kilometers. The Soviet Union didn't collapse. Every logistical problem grew worse as the front extended. By 1943, Germany was fighting a war of attrition that it could never win. And it all began in 1941, with a logistics system that broke under its own weight. The final truth: logistics won the war. The failure of the German war in the East was not caused by Soviet numbers alone, Stalin's leadership, British intelligence, American aid, Hitler's mistakes, winter, or even Moscow itself. All of these mattered, but none were decisive alone. The decisive factor was this: Germany did not build the logistical foundation to support a continental war. The Wehrmacht fought brilliantly. Its soldiers were experienced and skilled. Its generals were tactically gifted, but without fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts, even the best army collapses. War is decided not only by battles, but by the ability to fight battles. And in the summer of 1941, Germany advanced faster than its logistical system could support. From that moment forward, the Wehrmacht was doomed. And with the collapse of logistics, the entire German dream of conquering the East collapsed with it.